Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm getting ready to launch my next fiction project, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about it because writing is what I do, and talking about it with you guys just happens to be a side benefit. And whenever I can dovetail the two, I like to do that. So, The Drownway is a story about the Bravos of Nerona, a setting and storyline that I started playing around with probably 2.5 years ago, at least in concept. It began as an idea of a world that is inspired by RPGs, and I am hardly alone in this, but I was more interested in approaching this from the viewpoint of how would we create RPG-like scenarios in a consistently built world. Many RPG stories are very ad hoc, for lack of a better way to put it. They just grab a whole bunch of ideas that they like and they mash them together without a whole lot of concern about whether anything is going to make sense or whether or not they are contradicting themselves. They just want to have a good time having an adventure with a bunch of ideas that they enjoy thinking about. And I don't see anything wrong with that particularly. But it's not the way I like to tell a story. That said, I enjoy a lot of fantasy style content. I like RPGs. I've played them in both pen and paper and on the computer, and a little bit on console, although I've never been a big console gamer, but I know the general tropes that tend to drive these stories. So, a while back, I had the idea of using the trappings of Renaissance Italy as a sort of a fantasy setting. And within that fantasy Italy, there would be a lot of opportunities to present these different kinds of RPG-esque stories in a consistent world that scratches my personal storytelling itch. This was the origin of the Bravos of Nerona. And if you're not familiar with Renaissance Italy, a Bravo was kind of a mercenary or thug type of a person. They would play the streets, serving as bodyguards to wealthy merchants or nobles, and generally working to take care of all the kinds of odd jobs a wealthy person tends to have that they need to keep a certain distance from. Bravos should not be mistaken for true mercenaries. You don't make an army out of them. If you have a huge group of soldiers for hire, these would be called condottieri. Nerona has plenty of condottieri as well as plenty of bravos, but for the most part, I want the stories to focus on the bravos because most RPGs are not about large masses of troops flinging themselves at each other, although they are derived from those kind of games. And there is a certain amount of overlap, both in the game narratives and in history. Now, if you follow my blog at natechenpublications.com, I have already published several stories rotating around a cast of these bravos, characters who have different tasks they have to deal with on behalf of some wealthy patron. Some, although not all of these jobs, are based on the kind of quests you would get if you were playing a typical pen and paper or computer RPG. Rescue a nobleman's son, break a curse, find a magic item, things like that serve as a quick, concise way to ignite a conflict, get a person to an unusual locale, and have some exciting things happen. Yeah, a lot of these things are pretty mundane, give or take the curses at least, but they don't look that different from the kind of thing you might find in the modern day. It's the way people go about executing on these simple tasks that makes them really interesting. In a lot of ways, this is just a variation of the old writer's adage that there are no new stories. The really important thing is not the idea you have for a story, but rather how you execute on it. But there was one aspect of general RPG play in particular that I had to think a lot about, and that, as you may have already guessed by the title of this video, is dungeoneering. It is very common for adventurers in an RPG to go down into something known as a dungeon, a place full of traps and monsters and treasures, all crammed together in ways that tend not to make a lot of sense because these dungeons are usually created randomly by a game master with a book and a set of tables and some dice. They roll on the tables, they get a whole bunch of random results, and everything just sort of crams together in a giant, messy pile. Again, there's nothing wrong with that if you're just playing a fun game with some friends, but if you're looking to tell a story, at least the kinds of stories that I like to tell, you need to put some thought into how everything is going to fit together organically. And That is particularly relevant to the story that I am working on right now, which is called The Drown Way, because it is the record of a single dungeon delve told as a single story. Now, in RPG design, there is a lot of talk about dungeons and how to do them best. Some people think you should create them organically. Some people insist they should be created randomly, and often as a corollary on the spot rather than ahead of time. Some people think they should be homogeneous and their structures should make sense. Some people think it doesn't matter and things should be very spontaneous. Amongst very brainy dungeon designers, there is even the concept of the dungeon as a mythical underworld, where heroes go to challenge themselves and grow stronger. However, Nerona is an intersection of Renaissance Italy and fantasy. The mythic underworld is not really a great fit to that. Likewise, random and arbitrary dungeons really don't serve the flow of a story very well. That leaves us with deliberate, intentional dungeon design, which has a lot written about it. Dungeons in these kind of games come with a set of suggested challenges and information that players should get about those challenges as they go through that creates a sort of natural building escalation in how threats appear and how the characters can deal with them. If you follow these basic design elements, you'll get a very natural progression of information and events as your players work their way through the dungeon. However, dungeons structured in this way don't make for very good stories. The big reason for this is because there's really not a lot of downtime in the dungeon. Your characters are assumed to be on guard the whole time they're there, and depending on your design philosophy, they are likely to only run into hostile creatures, although that is much less certain depending on what kind of dungeon designer you happen to be. The big thing about most game designers as they make a dungeon is they don't include moments that will prompt the player characters to interact with each other. And there's a good reason for that. That's because the designers really don't know what kind of characters are going to come into their scenario and have to interact with each other. So it's very hard to prompt it. So I have approached 2 stories so far in the Bravos of Nerona setting that are inspired by dungeons. The first is The Lady of Marble, which you can read on my website. Again, that's neichenpublications.com. There's a link down in the description below. The Lady of Marble takes place on a mountainside, and the entire mountainside is essentially a dungeon. It's wild, it's mountainous, and at any point while you are climbing it, there is a chance you will get eaten by a rock. Referring, in this case, to the mythical large bird, not just a stone sitting by the path. I enjoyed writing this story, and I had a lot more ideas for the mountain as a stand-in for the dungeon that I wanted to use, but it was a short story, and I really couldn't execute on them as well as I wanted to. There wasn't enough space. The second story I tried to write as an expedition into a dungeon was called Woman on Fire, and I wanted to think of the dungeon in this case as more of a liminal space. The antagonists in the story were the Fair Folk, a fairy-like race of people that live under Nerona, and they live their lives by a set of very bizarre and difficult to understand rules that they insist are fair to all parties involved. I wrote that short story with 3 separate challenges in mind for the protagonist. The first was a navigational challenge. They actually had to get down a hole and into the underworld where the fair folk live. The second was a diplomatic challenge. They had to figure out what rules the fair folk were living by and how they could properly interact with them. The third was a physical challenge in the form of a dance. They had to dance with someone and dance until the end in order to satisfy the demands of the fair folk. This was not a true dungeon in that there were no monster-type creatures that the protagonist had to fight in order to safely navigate the dungeon, but I still think the story does a good job engaging with the trope as a way to tell an interesting story. If you're interested in reading that particular story, it is also available on my website. You can go there and read it for free. So what I'm working on now is a story I call The Drown Way. In this story, I have been a lot more careful and measured in the way I have set up the dungeon my characters are going to explore. It has to last them for a whole novella or novel's worth of story, after all, and it needs to do more than just present them with a bunch of monsters to fight. But it also, I think, needs to have a little bit more conflict in it than either the Lady of Marble or Woman on Fire specifically did. Because the dungeon should be a place of conflict. If dungeons were safe, everyone would go there and harvest the riches, and that's not what we want to happen. This is not the gold rush, this is the dungeon. That said, the dungeon can present dangers other than monsters attacking you, and knowing which specific dangers to throw at people is also a part of crafting a good story. So choosing a set of dangers that will speak well to the characters you wish to put in them is important. So, as you might guess by the title, The Drownway is a story that takes place at sea, or more accurately, beside the sea. The Drownway is a very precarious stretch of land that extends between two peninsulas in southern Nerona. It's about 40 or 50 miles long, and at high tide, most of it is underwater, with only a few places that extend above the waves where people can camp safely. The Drownway extends across the mouth of the Gulf of Lum, and the Gulf of Lum, as everyone knows, is full of dangerous underwater creatures known as the benthic. So, on top of having to safely navigate the tides and the muddy ground that makes up most of the Drownway, you also have to worry about getting ambushed by the benthic or being washed out to sea by a sudden and unexpected storm. So, right away, we have our dangers accounted for. But what is the promise of reward? Why would people go into the Drownway in the first place? Well, a couple of reasons. There are two major cities on these two peninsula that reach out from Nerona. So if you want to get from one city to the other, you can go all the way around the Gulf of Lum, which is several hundred miles and probably 2 weeks worth of travel, or you can spend 3 or 4 days picking your way across the Drownway. It's risky, but it can be rewarding. Unfortunately, not everyone who undertakes this journey makes it, and a lot of their stuff is still scattered about the Drownway for enterprising people to go and try and pick up. So the first reward would be scavenged wealth. The second reward is lost treasure. Much of the Gulf of Lum was above seawater at one point in its history. In the past, before the Gulf of Lum, Nerona included that land as part of its kingdom. In fact, the old capital is now underneath the Gulf of Lum. A lot of the treasures and artifacts of that lost land have generally made their way through wave action and other forces to the Drownway. They're not right there on the surface, but if you're willing to do some diving at low tide, you might be able to pick up a valuable artifact or two. And for most people, one of those three reasons, fast travel, scavenging, or searching for relics, are reasons enough to go to the Drownway. But I thought it would be good to have just one more to make our group stand out a little bit more, and that is a quest. Now, in the RPG space, not every quest is taking the ring to Mordor. Most quests, in fact, are fetch quests. You go and you do something for someone that they don't want to do themselves. And in the case of the heroes in the Drownway, they are going to try and locate a lost caravan. A merchant commissioned a group of people to move some cargo for him very quickly from one city to the other across the Drownway, and they've gone missing. If our heroes can find that lost caravan and its cargo, they'll be rewarded. It's a simple enough job, but the Drownway is a very complicated place and will probably make it more difficult than it needs to be. But then again, for us in the audience, that's the exciting part, and I hope you look forward to hearing a little bit more about it as the story begins to come out over the next few weeks. Like all the fiction I write, I will be posting this on my website. Again, that's natechenpublications.com, linked down in the description below. If you're interested in some fiction I've already completed, to give you a taste of what you can expect from the Drownway, I have a book called Have Spell Will Travel. You can get that on Amazon, and there's also a link to that in the description. Let me know what you think about designing dungeons for stories down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.